Hello, welcome to the next video. This video is about Python's iterables. Okay, and Python has several different types of iterable objects. An iterable functions like an array and other objects. It's sort of Python's version of an array, but just like C++ took the idea of an array and expanded it into things like vectors and linked lists, so Python has done the same. But they all function in a similar manner, and yet they have different capabilities and different limitations. So we'll review each type of iterable briefly in this video. The first iterable we're going to take a look at is a tuple. Okay, and we'll go over the properties and then we'll see how they work in code. But let's look at the properties of a typical tuple. For one thing, it's unchangeable. Okay, so you can't add or remove items. There's no append method like you could with, say, a list or other types of iterable objects. Are they indexed? Yes. In square brackets, they use index syntax, and you can access an element by its subscript number or its index number. Are they ordered? Yes, they have a defined order, and that order doesn't change. So that's one of the limitations of a tuple as opposed to, say, a list. Do they allow duplicates? Yes, they do allow duplicates. Basically, you're going to want to use a tuple when you need to just store multiple items in the same container. And unlike array limitations in other languages, the tuple iterable can allow you to store objects of different types. So let's say I wanted to store a string and an integer. That would be allowed in this particular data type. They're created with parentheses as opposed to square brackets. The syntax differs with other iterables in Python. And you have methods, you have similar methods that can be used with different classes of iterables. And with tuples, you have len to get the length or the number of elements, objects stored inside of it, count, and index to get a subscript value. So let's take a look at a typical example of a tuple. So in parentheses, we're going to create a tuple, and in this case, it's all strings. So MLP from the 6 main characters here. And we can print the whole tuple at once. So I could take just the name of the tuple here, and I could pass it into print. We could print all of those strings, one after the other, if we want to. But we can also iterate through the items contained within it. And this is what all iterables would have in common. We can plug them into repetition structures, into loops, and loop through them one element at a time. And that's where they become very useful for solving problems and for using in projects. So we have just a normal for loop here for x and tuple MLP main chars. And then we're going to increment this counter variable here just to keep track of it. We're going to display them, right, one by one. As we increment through in the for loop, as we iterate through the for loop, we'll go through in each string, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, indexed as 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We'll go through that. And then we're just going to display this here, accessing one particular element in a tuple. And again, here's that array syntax. In the square brackets, they have that array or index subscript value syntactically. So let's run this function and see what it does. Okay, so here's the whole tuple at once, and it's parenthetical, it's in parentheses, and then here it is going through our for loop, item by item, element by element. And these are all of the same data type, but just to show you, what if we change this to a different data type? And this is a no-no. In arrays and other languages, they demand that all the items stored in them be of the same data type, but not such a demand here. So I'll just change 2 of these. We'll make them integers. And if we were to run this again, all right, so now the code, we have integer data types, we have string data types. Let's hit F5. And you can see. So with tuples and several other different classes of iterables in Python, you can actually store objects of different data types in your, in your iterable. In this case, your tuple. All right. So let's take a look at the next example in code, and we'll comment this function out. And we'll go look at example 2 up here. Okay. We're just going to look at using the len method, right, for length. That would just give you the number of items or objects in your tuple. And again, this works with other iterables, which we'll see when we go over them. But using it with a tuple, just to show you what the len method would do. See a number of objects in tuple down here? It's 6. How many strings? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. But remember the fence post, we don't count 1 to 6, we count 0 through 5, but it's still 6 elements, right? So just giving you an example of the len method. Very useful function. Let's go take a look at our next example. And we'll go call the function tuples3. Okay. All right, so unlike arrays, to create a tuple with only one item, you have to leave a trailing comma. So syntactically, tuples are a bit different from, say, a list. I could make a list and I could just make it with one string or one integer, one data type, one monster, whatever. And then I could append, I could add items to it or remove items from it. There's pop and there's append, but with a tuple, if I'm going to make a tuple with just one object, I have to leave a trailing comma. So it is a bit different in syntax from other types of iterables in Python. And let's just run this example. We'll hit F5. Okay, so data type, and then we're using the type method. We've used this before in previous videos. Just returns the data type. Okay, but in this case, we're getting at, string and tuple. Okay, so if it's, in this case, if I don't have a trailing comma, notice that it's just a string. But if I do add a trailing comma, then it's a tuple, but a tuple with only one element or object. Okay? Let's go look at the next example. Clear the console. And let's look at our fourth example up here. Okay. And again, we're just looking at different data types here. But look, a string, an integer, a boolean, a string, an integer, a boolean. So 3 different data types, okay? And we're gonna, the name of our tuple is disorganized, chaotic, loosey-goosey objects with different data types. But we're gonna plug them into a for loop here. For x in our tuple right here, right? We're gonna count it and we're just gonna display, we're gonna use the type method, get the data type, and then we'll convert it to a string and display that string, okay? We'll store that here, and then we're just gonna display these messages here. So for the value, the number, the element that we're displaying from that tuple, and then its value, and then we'll get its data type and display all of that. We parse it, we cast it to a string, okay? So let's hit F5. And we'll look at returning the data type of all these different types of objects. Okay, so look, Charlie Sparkle, it's a string. 42, it's an integer. True, it's a boolean. Rainbow Dash, a string. 444, an integer. And then false, it's a bool or boolean. Okay. So just showing you that yes, we can use objects of different types here. In this example, we're going to illustrate that tuples, again, are immutable. They're unchangeable. So I can't add or remove items from a tuple. Once I create it, it's fixed in its size. If I'm going to add or remove something, I actually have to typecast it to a different data type. So I'd have to cast a tuple to a list, and then I could add or remove something to it. And then when I'm done, I could then turn around and typecast that list back to a tuple. And that's what we're going to do in this example here, okay? So we create a tuple here, okay? We have our 6 main characters, 6 strings. And then before conversion, we're going to display the tuple. But in order to be able to add something to it, let's say I want the 6 main characters of MLP plus I want to add a 7th string, Princess Celestia. I couldn't just add it to the tuple as I could if it were, say, a list. What I have to do is I have to cast it. So I have to typecast it to a list. Once I cast it to a list, then I can use the append method with the typical list object and add an additional string so it goes from 6 to 7. And then once I do that, I can typecast it back to a tuple. So, a bit of a cumbersome process, but that is a way to add or remove items from a tuple. But you can't do it from the tuple itself. You have to cast the data type to a list first, then you can add or remove, and then you cast it back to a tuple. So let's hit F5 and take a peek here at how this works. So here's our tuple. Here's our 6 strings, the main characters. All right, we cast, we add, and then we cast it back to a tuple. So we converted it to a list, and we converted it back to a tuple, and now we have our 7 strings right here. And we'll go look at example 6 here. Okay, we'll look at unpacking. And unpacking is something you can do with other iterables as well, but we'll look at unpacking with tuples in this instance. So we set up or declare a tuple here, right? We've got 6 strings, and then we're going to have some variables. And we're just going to assign to each of those variables in sequential order the values of our strings stored in our tuple. And just to show you that those values were indeed assigned and that that relationship was sequential and it was maintained, we'll display the variables one by one, okay? Hit F5. Okay, and here's our variables here. So this is sort of a shorthand way of assigning values to variables from an iterable, such as a tuple. It works with other objects like lists too, but it's called unpacking in Python. It's a technique you'll see used over and over in various types of code. Let's go look at example 7. And again, we're just going to plug this tuple here into a for loop. We have a tuple, we have 6 strings, plug it into a for loop. If we iterate through the for loop, one element at a time just displays those strings, okay? Let's clear the console down here and go look at example 8. Okay, here we have a tuple with strings, and here we have another tuple with strings, okay? And then two tuples together, we're just going to use the, this addition operator here, sort of overloaded, functionally overloaded addition operator, but we're just concatenating them. So just like we could concatenate 2 individual strings together with that overloaded addition operator, we can concatenate 2 tuples together. So all these strings stored in this tuple and all these strings stored in this tuple, and then we can display the result. So it's sort of a handy way to concatenate groups of strings together. Let's hit F5. Right, and here's the full cast. We have, in this case, the main characters, and we have the main antagonist all together here. Function number 9. We have another tuple here, and we're just going to look at, so what happens if we multiply? Can we do that? What happens if we multiply a tuple? And these are strings, they're not integers. It's not a numerical data type, not a digit. But what happens if we do this? If we take our tuple and we multiply it times 2, let's see what happens. I'm going to hit F5. Okay. And basically, we just doubled the amount of strings. We went from 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? 6 strings, index 0 through 5. Now we have 12 strings. Just duplicated all the strings inside of that tuple. In this example, we're going to take a look at the count method, and that will return the specified number of times a particular value exists inside of a tuple. So I'm going to hit F5 and run this example. Number of rainbow dashes in MLP equals 1, right? There can only be one rainbow dash, but look, I'm using the count method. I'm searching for this string. How many instances, how many times is this value inside of our tuple? So in this case, just one time. Now, what if I created the tuple and there was a rainbow dash clone? There could never be a clone, but what if there were? We'll add 2 more rainbow dashes there. And if I run it again, hit F5, this time there's 3 rainbow dashes in MLP, but of course everyone knows there can only be one rainbow dash. She's unclonable. Too awesome. Okay? And here we're just going to use the index method. It'll return the first occurrence of a specified value that exists in a tuple. So we're going to look for rainbow dash. And the first occurrence here is 0, 1, 2. Okay, so in the second element, there's rainbow dash. So let's clear the console down here, make a little room, hit F5 to run. Okay, index of rainbow dash is 2, right? 0, 1, 2. True, she is the third element in the array, but remember there's always that fence post or off by 1 issue with iterables when you index, okay? So we don't start counting at 1, we start counting at 0.